Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Hope everyone had a nice lunch, enjoyed the sunshine. We have a wonderful session this afternoon for Indigenous space analogs and learning from the Indigenous knowledge systems, which I'm very excited to learn from. So we have Alvin Harvey from the Diné of the Navajo Nation, Dr. Ren Freeman from the Eastern Shoshone Salish Kootenai, excuse me, and Nicole McGaw, Oglala Lakota. And they're here to share their wisdom with us and help us think about analog missions in a new way. So please give them a round of applause.
Yate shikis do yate dene. My name is Alvin Harvey. I'm of the Diné of the Navajo Nation. And as you're all coming in, feel free to have a seat. And my colleague and relative, Nicole, is coming around and offering some candy because I know this time of day, I want to take a nap too. So I understand the feeling with the shade and everything else like that, and just getting some sugar in us too. So she's coming around and offering some candy. Feel free to take whatever speaks to you. And she's also coming around and offering a stone that Nicole and Ren and I gathered not just a few days ago as we were coming into the area. But we'll come back to that. So grab a stone, grab some candy, and with the stone, whatever stone speaks to you or whatever shell speaks to you as well. But I'll begin in my people's way by saying Yate again, Shikis, do Shidene, She Alvin Harvey Yeneshye, do Bajna Ajinishle, Hananahi Bashichin, Bligana Dashiche, Ado Kia Ane Dashinele, Ukot Ego Dene Hastin Nishle. So in my people's way, we introduce ourselves and we offer our 4 clans. And one of the reasons that we do that is you never know who your relatives might be out in the crowd or wherever you are. And us Dene, as you know, we're all over the place and we have very many relatives everywhere. But we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, that conceptions of kinship, of relationality, and how it influences the way we think about our relationship with ecologies, whether it's earth ecologies or whether it's space ecologies. So in that good practice of me introducing myself, my people, my clans, my relatives, I'd also like to honor the relatives of this land. So next slide, please. Wonderful. Thank you, Robin. And this isn't so much a land acknowledgement, but it's a recognition that where we're gathered at today and the different science and the beautiful analog and the relationships being made today is in the homelands of people that are still here today. The O'odham and the Yaqui people, my people's cousins and relatives, are still here today, practicing their traditional knowledge, their language, their ways, living in harmony with an environment that to our people here might also seem a bit harsh or maybe alien to some, maybe different. But there are people here that are carrying knowledge, being able to live in harmony with the environment here, and also being able to travel in good ways, in relational ways. So just to recognize that we're gathered here today amongst the people that continue to caretake for the land that we're here for. Next slide, please. And that also extends to almost every analog that you all know of. So going all the way from this land here to the Mars Desert Research Station, it being on youth land, as well as even talking about NASA's NEMO off the coast of Seminole land, that all these different analogs, are in relationship. They are on land that is caretaken for by Indigenous people. So there's that aspect of this type of work, analog research for astronauts, the type of work that we're all interested in, is already in relationship with the land that is caretaken for traditionally by Indigenous people. And all of these Indigenous people are still here today as well. So all these people, no, you're good. I was just about to ask. All these people are carrying these sophisticated knowledges of how to live in relationship, both technically, engineering, scientifically, philosophically, and in moral and ethical ways, living in relationship with an environment that is dynamic and moving, and also knowing how to travel to other places, other ecologies. But what these Indigenous people, our people, are carrying, living in relationship with these lands, is really these understandings of these socio-ecological relationships that are supported by these generations of experiences with a particular land and with particular relatives. So there's this real prior aspect of science based on observation and experience that Indigenous people have not just with ecologies here on Earth, but thinking about space ecologies as well, the relationships that we have with the moon, the stars, and it being a process of science that is informing our ways of life, informing the way we travel, and really informing a way of thinking about engineering and science and actually doing the engineering and science too. Next slide, please. So when we think about these indigenous communities that we're all surrounded by, that we work on their land, there's this real impetus too of wanting to work with them, not just to access that sophisticated knowledge that they have, learning how to live sustainably and regeneratively with particular ecologies, but also there's certain other ethical, legal, and really just other needs to be able to expand and grow the different aspects and technicalities and ways of thinking about engineering and science, particularly for the space community as well as the analog community. So ethically, we want to have diverse voices and perspectives when it comes to designing the way we do analogs, thinking about traveling to space as well. And also just the aspect of really enhancing and challenging ourselves, thinking differently, gathering these different ideas in a respectful way, and opening the spaces for these different perspectives about how to travel, about how to design regenerative systems, and about how to design social systems as well. And social systems including how do we relate to stones, how do we relate to the moon, how do we relate to plants as well within the socio-ecological systems. So there's various needs, and in particular when it comes to this land here in what is known as the United States of America, there are legal requirements too that if you're receiving federal funding from NASA or other sources, that any activity that impacts Indigenous and Native American ways of life, and that can include space activities, rockets, or facilities, if it impacts their ways of life, that you must have a consultation process with them. So it sounds a little bit scary, but there are respectful and harmonious ways in which we can enter into those partnerships in mutually beneficial ways. And Dr. Freeman will talk a little bit about that as well. So we have a lot of motivation to be able to partner with Indigenous people, and then we'll move into the how to partner with Indigenous communities too. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate that Indigenous communities have always had these transdisciplinary approaches when it comes to traveling, when it comes to living amongst other people, amongst other relatives. But the way we think about Indigenous analogs when it comes to space travel is that it's really about the centering of a cultural value that is shared amongst Indigenous people, but also respective of our different communities. So my knowledge of being the net and the cedar trees there won't directly port over to the knowledge here, or the knowledge that Nicole knows of her community and her people's land and knowledge that is sourced from that land won't directly port over to, say, the Native Hawaiians, the Kanaka Maoli, and their land. So while we have these unique experiences and perspectives of our knowledge based on the land and where our people are from, we can still come around these shared stars, these shared principles. And Dr. Freeman will talk a little bit about that as it's framed in Indigenous research methodologies and methods.
Thank you, Dr. Harvey. Newly minted PhD. So, Zant, the Ve, good day, everyone. Nananya Rem Freeman, Nasosaniwat Pat, Na Aravich, Na Namana Namashakewak. I am Dr. Ren Freeman. I am an Eastern Shoshone woman. I am also a four-fielded Indigenous research, anthropologist, and STEM scientist. I'm also Canadian Cree from the Mashakewak people, and I am Comanche. In with my Cree blood, I'm also French and Scottish. So I'd like to acknowledge my land, my people. It's a way for me to feel grounded. It's a way for me to center the knowledge I have to share with you. So this is my land, my people, and currently I am here in this beautiful land up in northwestern Montana. I am on the lands of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai people. So I work with Indigenous knowledges. Being at the site of the creation of such knowledges is imperative. I'm located at the Salish Kootenai College. We're also a university. We have graduate programs, and myself and a few others are designing 2 PhD programs. My fur baby, Bully. So in looking at relationality, we must consider interdependence. So, IRM2. From a Western sense, methods are really the focal point and interest for us. From my perspective and a shared worldview, the philosophies, the theories, if not the value tenets, really is where we begin. And it's about self in relation. So who am I to wonder about that? And who am I to ask such questions? It begins there, and then quickly becomes a collective thought and thinking process. This is what we refer to as indigenous knowledge systems. So if we take a look at methodologies as the philosophies, the tenets that guide the choosing, even the development of the methods, we must maintain that congruency. So, what are indigenous research methodologies? Place-based. Do we ask the land? Who are we in relation to place, including space? We look at these in terms of creating. How I refer to this is, I am Shoshone because I belong to Shoshone land. It created me. So culture is socially constructed. Makes sense to me. I see my world. I have ways of knowing, being, and doing every day that often appear mundane, but they are grounded in what I know of my environment. They are methods, ways of knowing. And then how do we share this? This is what Alvin spoke about in terms of values, in terms of tenets, ways that we do things. Creating cultural values. We look at community as based on individual contribution. Look at partnerships. Today, there's probably 4 models: action research, participatory action research, collaborative, community. We evolve that to a next level that speaks to partnership. As an Indigenous scientist, I have to admit and engage the realities of social, economic, political, and environmental injustices in order for me to understand how I'm present today and tomorrow. That's how I engage my world. The understanding and then practice, it's a way to make meaning. So if we start with an idea, we talk to each other, we must create definitions. Do we agree here? Where do we not? We form a partnership before we move forward, including, such as in our case, we're discussing an analog. People say, where will this be? We haven't talked to the land yet. We can't tell you more until we know what the land says. That guides us. Now that's a high level concept, but science tells us how to do that. We already know how to do it. So, indigenous worldviews is an applied form of gaining knowledge, creating knowledge. It's about understanding a process, a system. My mentor, his name is Sean Wilson. About 42 years ago, a group of Maori, Australian, First Nation, a few of us Americans got together And we said, we won't be silent anymore. Our voice is important. So how do we do this? So it's a bit of a vanguard movement to get the academy to understand we don't need to learn how to be STEM scientists. We're still here because we already were. So a message, excuse me, and the dust is, so pardon my hoarseness here. So the message for teaching and as educators at any age is we already are. We already have this knowledge. We just need to remember and acknowledge it. Sean Wilson said, this work, in this case, is not about an indigenous perspective of an analog. It's creating an analog from indigenous perspectives. So we flip that narrative, we flip that, and you get a different approach, a different answer. Next slide, please. At the bottom of the last slide, you saw nothing about us without us. One of the issues we faced as Indigenous people is our knowledge has been taken without our permission, or it's been taken and we've not been acknowledged. So this whole system and process now is come work with us, as Alvin stressed. We'll share what we can, but there's a point of acceptance. Maybe you won't be able to hear what we have to say because it's not for you, or maybe not yet. So what that means is values are important, ethics. All of our work involves that. We as human beings, we're conditioned, whether we admit it or not. Within our work, you may have heard of the 4 R's, 6 R's. I work with 8. The last 2 that I work with are resilience and regeneration. Because even for us Indigenous people, we have to remember. And we have to learn how do we apply resilience in ways that are thriving, not just surviving. So in my work, I had to design for congruency my own analytic method. It's called NUA reasoning. NUA is the word for Shoshone, which means us people. And I work with the 8 R's as an Indigenous knowledge system that guides me. All of my work, because I'm Shoshone, it has to start with me. This is my model. And if we work together, it's my obligation to share what I can so you understand me and it's reciprocal. Next slide, please. Colleague Nicole McGaugh will talk more about operationalizing values. That's been an important part of my journey in my development as a professor of IRM2. People are, how do you apply a value? What does that look like? So that's what I teach. And Nicole will show you some ways to do this.
Thank you, Ren. Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole. Again, I'm Oglala Lakota, and I'm sharing a bit more about how we want to operationalize some of these Indigenous values with a big emphasis on that some part because I'm Lakota and I only have some perspectives and some knowledges as young as I am. And so I've identified 4 here, but by no means am I giving them prescriptively is that we should all center these in all our ways of doing, but I'm sharing some of them that we wanted to look at when we kind of start to think about how we can make an analog through an Indigenous lens. And so here we have resilience, which is a combination of adaptability, that is of course the concept to change and transform under stress, combined with the idea of robustness, which is surviving and recovering from that stress. And you need both to form resilience. 2, respect and relationality. Obviously, this is very important to us as Indigenous people, and I think important to a lot of people. How do we collaborate? How do we come together and respect each other and embrace our humanity as we engage in very collaborative spaces? 3, health and well-being, physiologically, mentally, socially. How do we excel at what we do? We need to be healthy, happy, and productive, I think is the 3 that we really talk about in spaceflight all the time. And lastly, communication, for the point of sharing information, for the point of being operational, as the first 3 points describe, and for the value of sharing and understanding how we can be efficient and talk to each other across boundaries. And so we developed some engineering aims and some research aims from these values. Next slide, please. So the first thing I want to say is with engineering aims and research aims, the thing about research, and I am a researcher, is, oftentimes you do kind of come out with a p-value and a yes or no, statistically significant. But when it comes to engineering, and something that I really admire from this community and from my work as an engineer, is that you come out with more than that. You set for a goal, you create an aim, and you come out with a blueprint of how to proceed. You come out with wisdom of like, this is the best way to go about it. And it's not something that you can necessarily show just quantitatively, but also qualitatively, and you walk away with that. And so I talk about these as engineering aims because they're creative and they are questioning ways that we can go about these things, if we can at all. So next 2, actually, if you can. Here are our first 2 aims. When we think about an analog. 1, how can Indigenous methods help build relationships of harmony and reciprocity with space ecologies? When it comes to Indigenous methodologies and methods in the field of space right now, a huge question for us as Indigenous people, not as a monolith, but for some of us, I should say, is how do we be in good relationship with this ecology that we are once from? We are all people of the stars, at least in my view and many people's view, and of course, through the idea of fission and mass and atoms and all those other beautiful things, is how do we rebuild that relationship, and how does it be something that is harmonious? And is my protocol, the things that I do, to honor my land here, is that something I can do in a space-like environment, in an analog environment, where I can respect the land? For example, we offer tobacco, the Lakota people, as a way of acknowledging the fact that we're in relationship with the land. And of course, like when I do that, it's a symbolism of, for example, I'm taking some bark off a tree, or I'm hunting and I'm fishing, and I can give something back and acknowledge that trade. But of course, can I do that in an analog environment? I don't know. I don't know if that's ethical. I don't know what the impact of that would be, and I don't know what the land wants. And so that's something, for example, that we can find out with an analog, with an Indigenous lens. Next. 2, how do we effectively and respectively prioritize Indigenous culture and ceremony in an astronaut-like schedule? This is a question that is, again, very applicable, I think, across the field. When we think about Indigenous people, it was a very difficult lifestyle, I think, that my ancestors led. And I think the thing that people forget when it comes to Indigenous methodologies in science is that we spent a lot of our time engaging in culture and art. We have archaeological and oral evidence of this across the board. It wasn't struggling all the time. It wasn't operationalized all the time. And what happens to our schedules when we prioritize things that are important to us as people? Can we become more efficient at the things that need to be done for those other needs? And I think that clearly my people, at least, had methods to do this, sophisticated heuristics to accomplish both like our human desires, our human needs for thriving, as well as the important things that we have to do, for example, as an astronaut, to keep the ship afloat. Next slide. Actually, next 3, I think. One more. There we go. The first one's a bit grayed out, but these 2 are research questions. Indigenous social dynamics. These are, again, things more that I want to understand. Does it have an effect? And the first one I bring up is, how do Indigenous methods create adaptable leadership structures? One of the strengths of my people, in my opinion, is that Indigenous people are very adaptive in the way that they approach conflict. They're very adaptable in the way that they approach problems. How would this fluid structure of being in a team translate to an Indigenous analog environment? And how might we measure it? For example, what would happen if we simulated an emergency situation, an evacuation, perhaps a breach? How, if we looked at things like speech patterns and frequencies, or we looked at rubrics and surveys evaluating certain situations that were recorded? how would that be handled? What kind of language would be used? And using these quantitative and qualitative metrics, I think we do have a path forward to begin collecting data and to answer these research questions. Next. Cool. And then one more, actually. Cool. These are the ones that I think is more of, if applicable, how do Indigenous peacemaking methods help to prevent and also resolve conflict? So one more. And I think this is a very distinct example of an Indigenous kind of method or practice for some people that are used to interact socially. We do have methods of coming together and resolving disputes that I think would be very effective in an analog environment, though I don't necessarily think that we should simulate large dissent. Next slide. So if applicable. Okay, 1, 2, I think. Perfect. Secondly, I'm speeding up so that we have time for the exercise at the end. But when it comes to Indigenous approaches to health and well-being, the first thing that I can think of is how can engaging in your own cultural protocol, Indigenous or otherwise, help relieve both chronic stress and acute stress. And again, I put up several metrics of how we can measure this as we continue to formulation of this analog. Next. And finally, when it comes to Indigenous approaches to well-being, how do Indigenous team frameworks organize and triage workload? How do we adapt? Let's say if a person goes out of service, they have some kind of injury, how would our team, adapt? And that really connects again to our communication and leadership structures. What will happen to the way that we treat each other when we know that someone is no longer able to contribute to the role that they want to? And so I think between all of these research aims, there's a lot of questions that I think an Indigenous lens through Indigenous people who have, again, Indigenous knowledge systems, who have Indigenous perspectives, can contribute to the world of space. And it's not, again, that we want to create, again, it's about the methodologies and methods. And I think that's something I really want to emphasize through these research aims and research questions, is that a lot of this work is intended to be applicable across the board. It's not like Indigenous people are not a race of people. We're individual nations that have some common approaches and common shared stars, as Alvin puts it, but we all have our own individual perspectives. And this idea of IRM and M2 is like, how can we bridge across those gaps and still acknowledge that we all have our own relationality and our own perspective? So I will let Alvin complete our talk by talking about the exercise, if everyone has their shell or their rock. But if you don't, I will pass the basket around one more time, and it's more about the message than anything.
Yeah, Nicole, well, thank you. I think one of the points Nicole made is these are just a few of the research questions that we can look at through an Indigenous paradigm of research and understanding our shared worldviews, but also understanding the differences between our perspectives of our unique people's knowledge systems. And one of the shared components that we discuss and that we agree that we share is how we think about systems. And with this stone that's been handed out, and Nicole will come around, and whichever stone or shell speaks to you, I want you to hold that in your hand. And when it comes to an Indigenous way of systems thinking, and each of us spoke about this as we spoke, is how do we live in relationship with the world? And the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of wanting to live life in a wise way, is about trying to find a way to live in harmony with the world around us, a world that is dynamic, that is moving, that is populated by many different forms of, as we say, relatives, including stones, including shells. So with this stone, as an exercise, I'd like you to frame 2 different ways of thinking about interacting with this stone. In one way, I'll say, let's look at the stone and try to extract some value from it. There might be minerals, there might be water. Let's just try to break it down and extract from it. Let's just try to control it and manage it and try to position it in a way that it has some sort of instrumental value to us. So that's one way of thinking about the environment. That's one way of doing systems thinking and systems engineering. And let's think about it a different way. Let's think about it in a way where we have a stone that we want to live in relationship with, that we want to live in harmony with, that we recognize that it does have instrumental but also intrinsic value to the way that we live life. And so living in harmony with the stone, living in harmony with an environment, doesn't matter if it appears abiotic or biotic, but living in relationship with that is part of the way we think about systems, part of the way we think about engineering and science. And so with this stone, just hold on to it a little bit longer. And it's in your care now, as we would say, that we don't own it. We're not here to manage it or control it, but it's in your care now. And you can think of this about our environment here on Earth, that it's in our care now. And you can think about it when it comes to space ecologies, whether you feel that relational aspect or whether you feel an affinity to it, that it's in our care now. And the way we think about engineering, health, systems, it's about living in that place of care and relationship with the stone, with the moon, and especially with each other, not just as human beings, but as all these biotic beings, from the lizards that you see running around and the bugs that we were finding in our beds and all that. I'm sure a few of you had that experience here a little bit, but trying to find a way to live in relationship with these ecologies, with these environments, changes the way we think about engineering and science. And we feel it'll change the way we think about designing an indigenous analog, an astronaut analog as well. So I want to express my gratitude to all of you for kind of sharing in this experience and this exercise, and being relatives to us as well, and being so kind and sharing us with your time and energy as well. So yeah, thank you. And thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Dr. Freeman, as well. So yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions before we go to the next speaker? We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions.
So I manage the Mars Desert Research Station and the Flashline Station, and up in Flashline, we actually have to talk. We are required to get our permit to talk to the Nunavut government, the tribal council, and we've done that. And I personally have Cherokee genetic heritage. My question is, in Utah, how could we best engage with the community there, and what advice do you have to be more inclusive to Native Americans and others?
I would actually love to turn it over to Ren. She's had a lot of expertise actually working in Colorado as a commissioner of Indian Affairs, working with you people in Colorado. So I'd love to get your expertise on that, please.
Thank you very much. And as a Shoshonean person, I am part of a very large linguistic family. Ute is Tek and Shoshonian or Nahuatl, and Ute are my relatives. And so, yes, there are protocols. The best advice I have is ask them, because even though we're related, we share protocol processes. You never know. The Ute tribe in northern Utah are very progressive thinkers. I admire them. They resist, they're resilient, and you'll know this from the moment you first speak to them. The first line, I would say, we use a process. If you're there to see so-and-so, you'll probably have to pass through 3 or 4 gatekeepers, and you won't exactly recognize what's going on. It's part of our systems, and you find this world over. So just say, I'd like to talk to your TIPO officer or your cultural resources, but I'd hesitate resources. We actually don't like the words resources or management. So read up, do your research. That's first, but typically you will be pointed toward someone working in historic preservation or environment. That'll be your first line of contact. Mhm.
Well, no, first of all, I have Pawnee ancestry myself. I'm from Oklahoma. I'd like to say thank you for the medicine. Very, very special. I would also like to ask if you have reached out to former NASA astronaut John Harrington. He was the first astronaut that I ever met and catalyzed my whole interest in space. And just a wonderful human being. I would love to reconnect with him if I ever get the chance, but he has done a lot of work since he's left NASA to work with Indigenous affairs and especially in STEM engagement. So if you haven't reached out to him, I'd like to know if you would be interested in doing that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And actually, Nicole and I just talked to him not just a few weeks ago about this idea, about having his perspective about the analog. And he seemed really interested. And man, he's pulled in so many different directions. Being kind of the recognized first to be in space as an Indigenous person is a lot of responsibility that he's taking on with such wisdom and clarity. So definitely, we're seeking his expertise. And we also currently have an astronaut now, Nicole Mann, who's the first Indigenous woman in space as well. So we're going to try to find a way to build that relationship with her and getting that kind of in the now and in the know expertise when it comes to being in space as well. Because I believe she just came back recently. Is that right, Ram? Yeah. So absolutely. I think we'll be looking for our relatives and relations. And, part of our experience here is finding allies, finding relatives, finding community members that we can kind of come together and share knowledge and experience and expertise and all these different types of medicines, as you put. So thank you. Wonderful suggestion.
Is there any chance we might see an analog facility run by Indigenous groups in the near future?
Absolutely. Actually, we just learned, was it just today, I believe, that there is a facility that's being built up in First Nations territory. So up on the greater north part there. And I'm forgetting which community it was, Matagani Nation. So there is a facility currently being built in consultation and collaboration with that specific nation. And I think it's in the beginning stages of that process of kind of understanding, as Ren talked about, like listening to the land and understanding the needs of the people in the community there. And so it's going to take a bit of time. I think it's still in the beginning stages, but I wish I could remember the name of it. I don't know if anyone else knows of that specific facility or the festival that or the gathering that they're putting together. Stardust. Okay, Stardust. So I don't know if they have a website, but we're going to keep an eye on that as well. And I would love to see, how we can collaborate with that too. And I know that we have other ideas as well to kind of get our, practice in or our experience with other analogs around here as well. And we know relatives from, again, Kanaka Maoli Place, so high seas, and as well as here building relationships with the community. And we're looking forward to trying to also develop our expertise in community to go ahead and develop these different analog sites, potentially with consultation of these tribal communities that are around here, around our homes.
Thank you very much to each of you. I am curious about exploring the frustrations that you may run into or places where you are exasperated with at dealing with our community, the space community, the science, the STEM community. I would wonder if you would be willing to share some pressure points that maybe you talk about behind closed doors in ways that we can learn from to be better in relation to you.
I really appreciate that question. And actually, I think Ran is one of our experts in being able to kind of navigate it, because it's not just a conversation or a challenge place that we have when it comes to talking about traveling to space, but amongst many different fields and disciplines and engineering, science, humanities, anthropology, especially. But we have these difficult challenges. And, I think we have to recognize that while we have these different philosophies, these different astro philosophies, is that there's actually still components that we can agree on. And so we can recognize the core differences about how we interact and view the world. And we can also understand that there are commonalities that we can come together. So recognizing both, in particular through some of the practices that especially Dr. Freeman embodies through Indigenous research methodologies and methods, being able to bring those differences and commonalities together to reach a place of mutual benefit. I mean, it's a difficult process. And I think part of the advice that we give, especially to other Indigenous researchers or people that want to be the allies and the bridge builders, especially, is having that resilience, but also recognizing that, it's not a path that you have to go on by yourself too. You have a lot of relatives that have good medicine, the energy and the time, just more practically to kind of support that way of thinking. But I think just beginning with a place of respect in a lot of ways. And I don't mean to say that in an insulting way, but in a way that we can come to and kind of remind ourselves, because part of relationality in our practice of Indigenous research is always coming to that place like, is what we're doing respectful? Is it respectful to our cultures, our traditions, the people of this land? And part of, I think, what we can come together around is just the respect of the different worldviews of Indigenous people and communities. And it's not so much a demand that you agree to everything that we say, because I think we have differences amongst our own people and communities as well. But just to have that respect and that kind of appreciation, and just as we are respecting and appreciating, the experiences, the diverse worldviews, and the different points of progress, or not just progress, but the points of healing and regeneration that we want to see in this community, that I believe all of you want to see as well. So I would love to hear a little bit more from, Nicole, please.
I can, I'll just say, like, I think in general for me, I feel like the emotion of frustration is always just really linked to being like misunderstood. And I think when it comes to like being asked like what we're frustrated about, and it's like, I mean, in some ways I cannot speak for all Indigenous people. And so I do not know. And I know there's a huge variety of perspectives across from the one we have all heard of, why are we going to space in the first place, to more concrete examples or more nuanced examples. And in some ways, right, they're all valid. They all need to be listened to, and we can form a consensus, and we can come together and come to a solution and come to an understanding. For me, I can say that when it comes to communicating like the importance of this work and kind of communicating it in general, it's definitely the idea and the reaction to a lot of this is that, it's the same as kind of like just inclusion, or it's a checkbox of like, I can't get my federal funding until I've like, demonstrated that I'm inclusive. And that's a different topic entirely in some ways. Like Indigenous research methodologies and methods are their methodology, they're a method, their approach, they're meant to be mutually beneficial, truly. And I think that's the one thing that's been really hard for me to communicate, and therefore sometimes frustrating, where it's not a requirement. I'm not prescribing something that must be done and that everyone should do it, and that I'm going to hold it against them if they don't. I'm trying to explain something that I think has value for humanity, because I know that we are all mutually interested in representing our humanity and traveling to space. And so that's my thing, is trying to communicate that properly, and using the right words and using the right language to understand that, consultation and working with Indigenous people, using some of these holistic, relational, Indigenous lenses can be really beneficial to your work and can help us all achieve that goal of like going to space for humanity overall.
Thank you so much. I would just like to ask, in as humble a way as I can, for your patience, for your tolerance. I put it this way: I was born colonized. History is real. We as Indigenous people are relearning. We need to remember. A large part of my work is to recognize I'm privileged because I was born and raised in my community, Shoshone land. Not everyone who identifies as being Indigenous has that. And that's a large learning curve for me personally. And so when we look at this in a global sense, a person identifying as being, say, of a tribe, I try to, again, in a humble way, ask them, what does that mean? We are in a point of hunger today. When Secretary Deb Haaland said we must utilize Indigenous knowledge, a large group of we who identify as Indigenous scholars, we actually were like, oh no, oh no. First of all, Indigenous knowledge is not singular, it's plural. Right there was a key indicator of how much more needs to be understood, known, and practiced among our own Native people. So right there is evidence of how far we have yet to go to, from the real history of being silenced erased. And yet we're in a rebirth because we've fought so hard to be heard. And now here we have this moment when we're like, are we ready? So we're still learning. And that's why coming together in these ways all over the world is deeply, desperately important. And so I ask, help us with your questions, your inquiry, your knowledge of me, because it must be reciprocal. That's the only way we're going to address how to thrive, how to celebrate. Those of you who know me, I kind of flip things. I never start with a deficit, and that's not a science way, right? But that makes it different because that's the way my people see life. Let's celebrate what does work and build on that. So that's a part of our understanding. It's a part of how we approach returning to space. Some of us are star people, are cosmologies. So it's not a let's go there, it's a let's return. That's another aspect of how we approach our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of you for sharing your voices with us and your wisdom. I think we all have a lot to learn and engage in more right relations. And so thank you for helping to show us your ways. And we learn that we hope we can continue to be better and better in cooperation. Thank you so much.